she is going to be with us for the next 2 years. Wonderful. And she will be giving a talk in December. I think December 2nd is the date of talk at the center. So we're really looking forward, and welcome to PHPS in the center. Thanks again. Next, bad news. Sharifi was supposed to be giving a talk on Friday, the philosophy of psychiatry, but she got COVID, so she's not coming, so she won't be here on Friday. So on Friday, we do not have any lecture. Next week, on Tuesday, we have a talk, but the talk is online, so it's a featured former fellows talk where we're bringing back former fellows, and they are giving lecture online. The talk is given by Mike Tomasello, who is one of the most famous psychologists working on children and apes. You can find information about how to log into the talk on the center's website, and it's at noon on Tuesday next week. On Friday next week, there is no lunchtime talk, but we have the second lecture of the annual lecture series at 3:30 on the 10th floor, and the talk will be given by Angela Potocznik. The title of the talk is Causes Don't Push. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and future colleague, Kareem Khalifa, who is currently the senior visiting fellow at the center for the whole year. He is still, unfortunately still, but only for a short period, professor of philosophy of science at UCLA, where he's been since 2002. Before that, he was professor of philosophy at Middlebury College. 22. But, oh yeah, 22, that's right. It's because I don't want to feel old. Fucking 20 years my age. I feel like I'm in my 30s, really. In any case, many of you know Kareem, so I don't need to spend a long time introducing him, but he works in general philosophy of science, in the philosophy of the social sciences. He's done a lot of important work on understanding, on explanation, on modeling. I will mention the title of his quite well-known book, Understanding, Explanation, and Scientific Knowledge, in 2017 with Cambridge University Press. He has published extensively in all the best journals. He has papers recently in philosophical studies about understanding. He has a paper in philosophy of science about explanation and topology, and so on and so forth. And it's been really wonderful to have him at the center for now a few weeks. He's working on a book on race, and I guess we will hear some of that today. The topic is Unifying Sociological Theories of Race. How is yours?
Thank you. So yes, as what Edouard mentioned, it's my great pleasure to sort of say this is the first talk where it's public knowledge that I will be joining Pitt HPS. So I'm just going to take a moment to sort of say a little bit about my relationship with the intellectual community here. 2010, 2011, I came here a bright-eyed, mostly confused assistant professor of philosophy from Middlebury College. I decided I wanted to come here to really figure out how to do philosophy of science well. And it was really sort of a spectacular year for me as a scholar. I took sort of 2 lessons back with me to Middlebury after that year. And the first was to just continue to do excellent work as best I could, given all the lessons that I learned here. And the second was to pay forward all the intellectual generosity that was given to me by many members of this community. And one of the nice things about joining Pitt HPS is I finally get to pay it back. So I'm really grateful for that. Today, I have 2 objectives. The first, as the title of my talk suggests, is I'm going to provide a framework for unifying sociological theories of race. I want to stress at the outset that this is very much in the early stages. So emphasis on a framework and not actually achieving unification to the level I would like, but maybe a suggestion of a path forward. But I think sort of the larger philosophical question I want to ask is why unify, right? And to do that, I'm going to explore various implications that happen from attempts or explorations of unification. And I'm going to sort of highlight 3 interesting arenas where I think these implications sort of are most salient to me. And they really fall, I think, largely under this first category, the scientific benefits of unification. And sort of under that umbrella, I think there are interesting implications for the metaphysics of race to explore and for science and values. So here's my plan of attack. I'll present the state of play regarding sociological theories of race. What you're going to see is there are calls for systematicity, but it's not quite clear what that call entails. And so what I'm going to do in section 2 is then offer a proposal for how you might go about systematizing or unifying sociological theories of race. I'll give you proof of concept by unifying two very prominent theories, and then we'll get to this question of why unify. So let's start with the state of play. Right? I think there's basically three take-home lessons I want you to learn from this. One, there are many theories of race in sociology. Two, some of the leading theorists of race are calling for systematicity. And three, sociology is a really weird place to call for systematicity. Right? So let's look at these in turn. Right? So today my focus is going to be just on two race theories. The first is the theory of structural racism, most readily associated with Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And I'll also look at theories of racial transformations from Omi and Winant. We'll talk more about those in a second, but I just want to sort of give you a sense of how this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So here's sort of a full survey, or maybe not a full survey, but a fuller survey of some of the race theories on tap. Starting from the bottom left-hand corner, we have theories of systemic racism, most readily associated with Joe Fegan. The sort of signature feature of these theories is they highlight the historical entrenchedness or entrenchment of racial inequalities and the path dependency of our current racial inequalities on those earlier racial inequalities. Second, we have theories of stereotypes and stereotype threats. So probably a lot of you know Claude Steele's work. I'll just point out that there's a much longer sociological tradition which you can lean to, Bloomer's symbolic interactionism, of which this is sort of the latest iteration. There's intersectional theories, such as Crenshaw's and Hill Collins. There's sort of colonial approaches to theories of race, like Quijano and Mignolo. There's social critiques of biomedical conceptions of race that you see with Dorothy Roberts. And I don't quite know how to describe this racial order book, but it's a very ambitious theoretical book that is sort of part of a larger project of relational sociology associated with Amir Bayer and Desmond. That one I'm going to spend a lot of time on, but not today. So crucial bit is many of the leading theorists, people on that previous slide, right, have been calling for greater systematicity when it comes to race. And I just want to give you a few representative quotations. So Bonilla Silva, in a pioneering paper from 1997 called Rethinking Racism, says the area of race and ethnic studies lacks a sound theoretical apparatus. He's particularly concerned about the lack of theorizing about structural racism, of course. Howard Winant, in a review article in 2000, writes, the inadequacy of the range of theoretical approaches to race available in sociology at the turn of the 21st century is striking, right? Fegan, in multiple editions of Racist America, basically says, look, we have pretty good theories of class oppression and gender depression, but theories of racist oppression are lagging behind in all sorts of ways. Right? Omi and Winant, in the most recent edition of their book, right, despite the enormous legacy and volume of racial theory, the concept of race remains poorly understood and inadequately explained. And finally, most pithily, Amir Bayer and Desmond say there has never been a comprehensive and systematic theory of race, right? So clearly there's some itch that isn't being scratched here, right? But we philosophers who have thought about systematicity and unification might think that this is a really weird place to look for it. And I'm going to try to give you at least what I think of as my diagnosis of why this is a strange place to look for systematicity, right? When we think of sort of our gold star examples of unification, they typically involve theories with really rich mathematical structures. So this is obvious in physics, but even think about something like the modern synthesis, where the mathematization of population genetics was really instrumental, right? I think all of this is really nicely documented by Margie Morrison in her wonderful book, Unifying Scientific Theories. But of course, we have none of that mathematical structure when we look at sociological theories of race, right? And so the question is, what's really doing the unifying at this point, right? And furthermore, when we get into this question of why unify, this gets trickier because it's not just that the theories are sort of qualitatively glossed, right? A lot of the most interesting evidence in support of those theories is also qualitative in nature, right? So we have things like case studies, ethnographies, theoretically tinged histories, and so on and so forth. And that's some of the most insightful evidence that we have for these different theories. But when we think often about how unifications sort of earn their stripes, it's often that rich mathematical unifying structure yields something like a novel prediction, which ends up clinching the theory, right? And we don't have that in this case either. So it's not clear what's going to actually allow unification to earn its keep in this hostile environment, as I'm calling it. So despite the fact that this is a really curious corner of the scientific ecosystem to be looking for systematicity, I'm going to try and offer a proposal for how we might go about doing this. The core idea is basically this, right? Sociological theories of race answer the same kinds of questions using the same kinds of models. Right? So obviously, for that to have any bite, I have to give you a sense of what the similarity of questions are, and I'll do that first. And then the similarity of their answers through what I'll call answer schemas, which are basically not unrelated to Andrea Lecker's notion of model templates. These are basically schemas for generating models that will answer the questions of interest. Okay, so the first part of this concerns questions, right? And I'm going to say that sociological theories of race primarily seek to answer what I'll call social outcome questions, or SOCs for short. So let me just give you a concrete example of a SOC. Suppose we run an audit study and we ask, why do black applicants get hired less frequently than similarly qualified white applicants for the same job, right? What I want to suggest is you can see this as instantiating a more general pattern, right? Which is basically asking, why are there racial differences in social outcomes, right? Now, these bold-faced yellow terms are what I'm going to call schematic variables, right? Meaning that they're variables which take as their values more specific variables, and in some cases, structures between variables. And at the risk of spoiling what's going to happen in a few slides, these are frequently going to be causal structures in this particular case. Okay, so although they're schematic, that doesn't mean they're completely unconstrained. There's a difference between, for example, race and other kinds of social outcomes. So I'll give you what I'm going to call filling instructions for these different schematic variables, right? These are just broad constraints which sort of tell you what you're looking for in terms of the kind of variable that will more concretely instantiate these things, right? So we have, typically, we're going to look for race variables that have accepted race categories in the nation under study, right? That's what we'll be looking for here, right? Note that often social scientists have pretty well established ways of operationalizing those variables, which puts further constraints on things. So the US Census categories are perhaps the paradigmatic example of how we operationalize race categories in the US. Right? There's going to be some edge cases where it's not clear whether a category is an ethnic category or a race category. So historically, Hispanic has been the one that has sort of had this status. In the US, I predict that with the introduction of the Middle Eastern North African category, we're going to have similar discussions about that as well, but to be determined, right? In this case, I think it's kind of a modeling choice whether you treat this as a race variable or as an ethnicity variable. It's clearly going to matter, for example, if you're looking for, say, racial differences within the ethnic category, for instance, whether you choose to model it one way or the other, right? So once again, whenever you see these off-white boxes with arrows pointing towards words, those will be filling instructions in what follows for, and whatever they're pointing to will be schematic variables. Okay, social outcomes, as you might imagine, is a pretty wide and motley crew. I'm going to sort of lazily refer to them as things that are typically filled in by sociologists' go-to variables and concepts. So things like income, employment, occupation, education. In more qualitative work, it might be meanings or values, and so on and so forth. Finally, differences sort of are pretty straightforward. I think the sort of most intuitive version is going to be where there's a correlation between a race variable and your social outcome variable, but it needn't be a correlation. It might have more mathematical structure than that. You have an equation representing those differences, right? Or it might be qualitative in nature and more interpretive work, for example. Okay, so much for sort of spelling out what I mean when I say that theories of race answer the same kinds of questions. Obviously, the real action happens in claiming that they answer these questions in the same sorts of ways, right? And so the claim is that basically sociological theories of race answer social outcome questions using what I'll call racialized mechanism models, right? Once again, there's a pithy acronym, RAMS for short. They wear socks. Right? Okay, so suppose we have an association between race and outcome as our social outcome question suggests. It seems to me this is a fairly obvious explanatory strategy for answering that. You might search for a social mechanism that mediates between the race variable and the outcome variable. And of course, the question then becomes, what do we mean by a social mechanism? Right? For this, I'm going to use the work of James Coleman, and this has been carried over by others. So James Coleman was a sociologist. These are frequently called Coleman votes, just so you know. And the crucial feature, we'll zoom in a little bit on some details throughout the talk, is basically that it's a way of accounting for macro level associations on the deck of the Coleman vote. using everything below deck, right? Is roughly the idea. Now, Coleman's famous example of this was modeling Weber's work in the Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism using a Coleman vote, right? So very roughly, the question that gets asked is, why is it that countries that have a larger share of Protestants end up seeing capitalism emerge earlier, right? Very roughly the question. The claim is there's something like a Protestant ethic, the Protestant work ethic, as we know, right, which produces certain kinds of economic behaviors which are conducive to capitalism. Roughly the kind of story that we get there, right? Let's walk through what this might look like when we turn from social mechanisms in general to racialized mechanisms in particular, right? So the deck of our Coleman boat is already set by our social outcome question, right? We know that we're going to have race basically as one of our macro variables and the outcome as the other. And I'm just going to, I think it fits better with the story that gets told that race is what Coleman would call a macro level cause, and the outcome is the macro level effect, right? What I'll now do is sort of walk through the hull of the boat in piecemeal fashion. I think it's easier to start with the bottom left-hand corner with agents' attitudes, right? So Coleman himself was pretty committed to something like methodological individualism. I don't want to commit myself to that. So I'm going to have a more Catholic version of what an agent is, if I can pun on an earlier theme, right? So the thought is they can be individual agents, but they can also be collective agents. And moreover, collective agents can occur at varying scales. So you might have a dyad, right, a duo of people. You might have a social movement. You might have a government organization. You might have some kind of firm, et cetera, right? All of that is sort of fair game in this model, right? Crucially, because this is coming at the head of that arrow from race, right? We should expect a set of agents, often having racial differences that track with attitudinal differences as well, right? So that sort of tells us what a situational mechanism's job description is, right? It's got to specify how racial groupings affect agents' attitudes, right? That's its job description, sort of its implicit definition, if you want to think about it that way. And there's sort of two big resources that sociologists use to specify these kinds of mechanisms. The first are what you might think of as more ideational kinds of resources, right? So things like meanings, values, and expectations associated with different racial categories. And then there's also going to be what we might call material conditions, which are going to be more go-to variables of various sorts, right? And I'll give you an example of this in a second, just so it's not so abstract, right? Action formation mechanism, clearly its job description is going to be how do we get from those agents' attitudes, which have been determined by the situational mechanism, to the behaviors at the front of the bottom right-hand corner, right? Typically, what gets used here are either folk psychological explanations or more commonly decision theoretic representations. But in principle, right, this is all, you can be fairly flexible about this as well. And I think it's an interesting question about how flexible you want to be about it. I'm going to assume that behavior is straightforward. Transformation mechanisms, right, are then basically ways in which you have sort of descriptions of a small number of agents, and you have to say, how does this scale up to produce the macro level effect, right? The simple version of this would be something like addition, but that's obviously going to be too simple in many cases. So you'll need to think of things like power differentials and institutional structures and how things propagate across a society and so on and so forth, right? So when we go back to our question, what we actually realize is that this doesn't fully instantiate the Coleman vote. And I think there's a few different ways of understanding this. You might think that model's abstract, and so you don't need to instantiate this whole theoretical structure, would be one way to think about it. Or you might think, wouldn't it be nice if we had the complete story, right? I'm not going to take a stance on that. But if we think about this, we know that basically we can start to build the Coleman vote from this, right? So you can kind of imagine in a society much like our own, right, that there's various kinds of stereotypes which are in circulation in a society. There's going to be existing educational and employment inequalities along racial lines, right? This then sort of structures an employer's perception of applicants' qualifications. So even when they are qualified, there might be certain ways in which that gets misperceived or distorted, right? That in turn leads to discriminatory hiring, and that explains the differential in job offers that we started with, right? But if we wanted to round out this Coleman vote, you could see how it might work out. There might be some kind of aggregation mechanism that then explains things like racial differences in employment, occupation, and income. Okay, so that's the general claim, right? That on the one hand, all the race theories seek to answer social outcome questions, and that furthermore, they do so by deploying these racialized mechanism models. And what I'll now do is sort of show you that, at least with two very prominent theories, it's looking promising. And I want to stress right at the outset, there's a lot more work to do, which I'll try to get into in the last part of the talk. So first, let's talk about formation theories from Omi and Winant. Right. Central idea is basically that racial categories are created, transformed, and destroyed through the interaction of racial projects. So what do they mean by racial projects? Right. They are efforts to distribute various kinds of resources along racial lines. The fact that they're efforts ends up being important in what follows, so just take note of that. And then how do they characterize racial lines or race? Right. They're basically determined by attaching a lot of these ideational concepts that I mentioned before to groups of people with different geographic ancestries. Omi and Winant spent a lot of time focusing on the phenotypic dimension of racialization. But as they themselves note, that's a proxy for geographic ancestry. And for various reasons relating to racial formation in the US, it's pretty clear that geographic ancestry trumps phenotypic criteria when those two are not sort of in harmony with each other, right? In terms of traditional or sort of racial conceptions. Okay, so it might then look like their social outcome question, or their question is, how do racial categories change over time? And on the face of this, this might not look like a social outcome question, right? Right, so if we look, we kind of think to ourselves, well, isn't just all of that in the upper left-hand corner of this boat, right? But of course, because Omi and Winant think that racial taxonomies themselves are social outcomes, what they basically end up having, or so I would submit, is basically an earlier racial categorization and a later racial categorization or taxonomy, right? And the question is, how do we get from point A to point B, essentially? And what I want to suggest is that we can see this as being broadly amenable to a racialized mechanism model or a Coleman boat, right? Remember that racial projects are efforts, as I pointed out before, so that they have certain aims. There's certain ways that they want resources to be distributed along racial lines, right? Now, like me, Omi and Winant are going to be fairly pluralistic about what kinds of things can pursue or deploy racial projects. Those happen at multiple scales, so it can happen once again at the individual level and at varying degrees of collective levels, right? And then essentially what's going to happen is these different racial projects are going to interact, right? Some of them are going to succeed and some of them are going to fail, and that's going to tell us sort of where the resource allocations are at, right? Right now we don't have a new racial category, right? But the thought is that new racial categories then play an important functional role, right? Which is they're supposed to sort of say like, hey, these people have these sorts of resources, and we kind of want to make sure that they don't get these other resources over here. And I'll give you an example of that now, right? So suppose we ask the question, how did Chinese become a US racial category, right? So at the top of our boat, the deck of our boat, we'll probably be looking at racial categories at roughly these two time points. So a pretty nice benchmark is in 1860 is the first time that Chinese shows up on a US census, only in California, right? Prior to that, it's not on the census. And so there's sort of a gradual sort of process here that leads you to introduce Chinese as a racial category, right? Now, when we start thinking about the Coleman boat for this, right, one of the key material conditions we're going to look at is the influx of Chinese immigrants in the 1850s, right? One thing that's going to sort of pop out of that is that there ends up being a new player, right, in the labor markets, chiefly concerning the gold rush and the railroad labor market, right? Excuse me. Essentially, what will happen after that is there's a growing share of Chinese laborers in this market, right? And now all of a sudden it looks like there's a need for a new racial category, right? Here are some folks who are basically starting to play an important role in these labor markets. And partly what we want to make sure is that they don't play a role in other labor markets. That's basically the claim, right? So one way that this often gets represented in histories is the rise of the yellow peril, right? And I'll just sort of give you a hint of what this looks like with one data point, if I can. So this is Horace Greeley. How many people are familiar with Horace Greeley? Okay, so yeah, so he was a fairly progressive man for his time. He was sort of ahead of the curve in terms of feminism. He was someone who exhorted Lincoln to be more progressive about abolition. He was a vegetarian. Temperance was considered a progressive cause that he was in favor of. And he also ran the New York Tribune. So he writes this editorial in 1854, Chinese immigration to California, and parts of it are sympathetic to the plight of Chinese workers, and he has some nice things to say about Christian Chinese immigrants and the wealthier ones. But he says, on the whole, they're for the most part an industrious people, forbearing and patient of injury, quiet and peaceable in their habits, right? Good things to do if you're going to be working the railroads, right? Good things to have as features, right? But he continues in less flattering terms. And I think what you can see here is a kind of policing of where he wants those resource allocations to go for Chinese folks. So I'll read this aloud. Keep in mind that I'm quoting here, so don't take a soundbite and make me look like a jerk, right? Say this and you have said all good that can be said of them. They are uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations. Lustful and sensual in their dispositions. Every female is a prostitute of the basest order. The first words of English that they learn are terms of obscenity or profanity, and beyond this, they care to learn no more, right? So this is basically saying, all right, they're fine working the railroads, but we don't want them elsewhere, right? It's basically the sort of story that we get from this, right? Now, crucial lesson I just want you to see from all this is it looks like they are answering social outcome questions and answering those with racialized mechanism models, right? I'm now going to run a similar story with Bonilla Silva's theory of structural racism, right? But what I'm going to show you is that this one's actually a little bit richer, particularly in terms of the situational mechanism, which I think is interesting in certain kinds of ways. All right, so core idea of Bonilla Silva, where you get this title, Racism Without Racists, is that racism is more fundamentally attributed to social structures or social systems than to individual psychologies, right? What does he mean by a social structure or system? He says racialized social systems are societies in which economic, political, social, and ideological levels are partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories or races. So note that what's doing the partial structuring here is race, right? He doesn't say too much about race, but he seems to largely think that Omi and Wynant have the right view about how racial categories come into existence, is basically the story there, right? So it's more a theory of racism than a theory of race, might be a way to put this. So if we start thinking of the main research question he's asking, you can see that this once again sort of resonates with the title of the book, right? Why do racial inequalities persist despite little overt prejudice by white Americans, right? So pretty clearly, right, racial differences in social outcomes and racial inequalities are sort of near synonyms of each other, right? This is just a little sidebar because I like thinking about questions in science. The rest of this is a presupposition, which I think actually plays a really interesting role in the kinds of explanations you seek, right? And essentially what it does is it constrains the space of admissible answers in two ways. So the obvious way is you can't account for those racial inequalities by appealing to overt prejudice by white Americans, right? That's not so interesting. But Bonilla Silva is in particular looking for a common cause, both of the racial inequalities and of the lack of overt prejudice, right? Which I think ends up being interesting when we see how to model this, right? So we have our racialized mechanism model. And basically, the crucial move that he makes here is he treats white ideology as an important situational mechanism in the language of Coleman, right? So white ideology has sort of two important causal roles, and I'll talk about them in succession, right? The first and more straightforward one is that white ideology rationalizes certain attitudes, right? That leads to certain behaviors that are rationalized, and those behaviors in turn then reinforce the inequalities at the macro level. It's basically a claim. I'll give you an example of this in a couple of slides. The other one, which is kind of neat, I didn't really see it until I started drawing these diagrams, is there's an interesting case of double prevention that I think is integral to ideologies. A thought is we have something like awareness or consciousness in the more sort of Marxist language. And if that were to sort of proceed unimpeded, right, it would prevent the rationalizing attitudes, and we might think that that in turn might have different downstream effects in terms of the persistence of inequalities, right? But what white ideology does is it actually prevents that awareness, right? This is the sort of concealing factor of ideology that you frequently hear about, while simultaneously favoring those rationalizing attitudes, right? So this is all very abstract. Let me sort of give you an example. I've been trying to, in each of these cases, I tried to come up with a novel example just to make sure that it actually worked for me that I could make sense of it. So this is a study which doesn't explicitly deploy Bonilla Silva's work, but I think nicely exemplifies what they're talking about by Dara Okike and authors. So they interview a bunch of people about, a bunch of parents about their housing preferences. And they find that lots of white parents say things like, oh, neighborhood diversity is fantastic. We think it's a really good thing, right? But then you ask them to sort of rank where neighborhood diversity sits relative to other considerations used in their housing preferences. And they say like, look, I think diversity is great, but I prefer a house, right, in a good public school district that's close to my family, right, that is an easy commute to work. And lo and behold, right, those preferences, right, end up pushing them towards white neighborhoods, right, which of course perpetuates segregation, right? So that's sort of that one causal path. Let's look at the double prevention. And here, I think we need to appeal to, I think what's probably the most prominent theoretical concept in Bonilla Silva's book, right? Ideologies, amongst other things, frame situations, right? And the frame that he focuses the most on is what he calls the abstract liberal frame, right? So what happens in this case is that you frame certain kinds of social phenomena, right, using the ideas of political liberalism, so equal opportunity, the idea that force should not be used to achieve social policy, or more interestingly in this case, economic liberalism in terms of choice and individualism. And you do that in a way to account for racial inequalities, right? So if you think that what's happening is basically there's a free housing market where you can treat neighborhood diversity sort of on a par with having 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, right, or something like that, then you can see why the housing market, the housing patterns that we see are what they are, right? It's just an exercise of free choices. But of course, historically, housing markets have not been free markets for all sorts of people, most notably people of color, right? And this is the kind of thing Bonilla Silva would appeal to, right? Okay, so take-home lessons at this point are, it looks like at least 2 of those many race theories that we've looked at broadly fit this template that I'm trying to sort of put forward as a way of unifying theories of race and sociology. I now want to turn to the larger question of why unify, right? And maybe to lower expectations a little bit, I should say, why even explore a unified theory in a seemingly hostile environment, right? Is really a better way of maybe framing my question. Right? And here's sort of the short answer that I want to give. And basically everything from here on out is going to be very speculative, but it boils down to this lesson, right? Unification has heuristic value even for its critics, right? Is the claim that I want to make. Now, to do that, I'm going to engage in a little bit of Kitcherian stage setting, right? I need to sort of say a little bit about what I mean by unification, and I sort of cut my teeth on unification by reading Kitcher's 1989 piece on explanatory unification. I'm going to be selective in what I pluck from Kitcher. If you want to talk about the details of that during Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But I think you can see that these are broadly sort of Kitcherian ideas about unification, right? Unification for Kitcher increases once we have a wider variety of phenomena that we can explain with a unifying framework, right? I'll call this scope and we'll discuss it in 4.1, right? Fewer schemas are used to explain phenomena. I'll call that simplicity and we'll discuss that in 4.3. The filling instructions for these schemas become more stringent. That's a kind of precision, right? And then finally, Kitcher would put this in terms of inferential structure. I'm going to put it in terms of causal structure. For those of you who are Kitcherian unification stands, this is what he calls classification in that 89 piece. The causal structure of these schemas also becomes more stringent, right? So I'll use these to sort of organize my discussion of why we should unify. Let's start with scope, right? So I haven't shown you that the unified theory can explain more than the conjunction of the 2 disunified theories. I've just said it looks like it can sort of capture everything that they do, right? So it's essentially a tie, right? Given what I've shown. Right? It's not a tie in the broader scheme of things, which I'll explain in a second, right? But note that there's already interesting heuristic value that we can get from this, right? If I'm a unifier, right, what I'm going to do is search for phenomena that are explained only by the unifying theory, right? So I'm going to try and find, right, one of those Coleman boats where it doesn't fit any of the other existing theories in terms of its either situational mechanism or its action formation mechanism or its transformational mechanism, right? That sort of tells me in broad outlines what I should be looking for, right? In a way that I might not otherwise have if there weren't a unified theory in circulation, right? Now, if I'm sort of critical, right, of unification, what I'm going to try to do is find something that doesn't fit the Coleman boat at all, right? That's really what I'm going to be looking for, right? So you can imagine just if I had the privilege and the opportunity to talk to, let's say, Bonilla Silva, he might say, no, this Coleman boat's the wrong way of thinking about this. There's something about that structure which is wrong, right? And it may be that the existing ones happen to overlap perfectly, but when we start exploring more of the theoretical space, we can actually find cases that that don't sort of line up neatly, right? And of course, there's a lot more work to be done here because there's a lot more race theory. So I have my work cut out for me, right? In a way that, so there's a lot more to be done on this front. But what I'll be looking for here is how well can I basically represent these as Coleman. Okay, so let's turn to precision, right? And I'll start off by making just a modest point, which is nothing that Omi and Winan or Bonilla Silva say suggests that they're committed to representing their theories as Coleman boats. They might say, oh, we don't know that we're committed to this causal structure, right? So as the admiral of the Coleman boat, right, what I want to say is, at the very least, what I've done here is given an occasion to be more explicit about the causal structures that might be in play here, which I think might be sort of heuristically valuable unto itself. But of course, unification isn't about the explicitness of causal structures. It's about the stringency of causal structures. And here things get messier, right? But interesting, right? So I'm going to take this because I think it's sort of the exemplary case, right? It's really clear that Bonilla Silva has a much more detailed situational mechanism on the left than what the unified theory has on the right, right? So what can we say about that if we think about those criteria of unification? Right, the filling instructions for the unifying schemas are less stringent, right? So there's lots of situational mechanisms that might not invoke white ideology, right? Agents' attitudes might include neither awareness nor rationalizing attitudes, for example, right? The causal structure is also less stringent on the right than on the left, right? There needn't be a double prevention structure in the general version of the situational mechanism, right? Now, what I want to point out is when we control for scope, we once again end up getting some heuristic benefits. So this can go one of two ways. I've sort of given you one way. One is that it turns out that we find that there are certain situational mechanisms that don't have double prevention structures, for example, right? In which case, right, basically the causal structure is going to be identical for the unifying theory and for Bonilla Silva, right? The other thing is we might find that there are actually double prevention structures, right, in every situational mechanism. And if that happens, then note we get to enrich our unification schema in a really productive way, right? All of a sudden we have a more stringent unifying schema, right? So it's going to go one of those two ways, is basically the claim. I tend to think we aren't going to find double preventions, right, with every situational mechanism involving race. So I'm going to bet on this, but that's certainly an open empirical question. Here's, I think, a more obvious place in which heuristic value becomes apparent on the unification scheme, right? It's really clear that actually Bonilla Silva needs something like a transformational mechanism, but he says virtually nothing about it. And so this is sort of an exhortation for him to pony that up, right? Why do I say he needs this? Well, keep in mind, theoretically, what he's talking about is a racialized social system, right? A really big macro entity, right? His evidence is all sort of small n interviews. And so the question is, how do you know how that scales up, right? It's not saying that the small n interviews are bad. It's just saying there's a further part of that story that needs to be told if we're going to get from there to talking about a racialized social system, right? And so this is a place where I think unification says, hey, you've got part of the structure right, but here are some things that you've under-theorized in your work, right? So there's another heuristic benefit, I think, of unification. Right? Let's turn to simplicity, which I think is the most interesting of these, right? So this is the idea that fewer schema are used to explain phenomena, right? So we know that I only need the racialized mechanism models. It's not clear how many models are actually kicking around in these two books over here, but it's at least two. I don't think they would see themselves as offering the same kinds of explanations as each other. And it's probably a lot more than that, right? So it looks like I have a slight advantage in terms of simplicity, but the question is, why keep things simple, right? And here's really the core idea I want to get from this. Once again, another heuristic benefit is that simpler theories encourage scientists to revisit their commitments, right? And I think this is really striking in this particular example, right? There's lots of things that are basically consensus amongst all these race theorists. But what I want to suggest is many of them are contingent features of the theorists and not baked into the theoretical structure. And I think this ends up being quite important. So I'm going to give you two different cases where this pops up, right? So very roughly, here are the kinds of conversations that I hope pop up, right? We look at a unified theory. We see that there's some cherished commitment that's widely held amongst the group of race theorists in sociology that isn't entailed by the theory, right? And I think there's at least three options we should consider, right? One is that maybe that commitment is worth dispensing with altogether, right? Another is it's indispensable, but only for a subset of the models of the theory, right? And then a third is it might be admissible everywhere in every model of a theory, but it's merely an optional modeling choice, not something that's foisted upon you, right? You'd still be doing good theorizing about race even if you didn't have that commitment, right? So the first place I'll look is the metaphysics of race, right? Where virtually every theorist of race is a social constructionist about race, where what that means is they think race is a social kind or a social entity, but that it's also real, right? I should also say, the yellow is what I'm betting on, but I'm not going to give you real arguments for this. I'm just going to give you sort of some suggestions as to why I think this is the case, right? So I think that this is most likely going to end up being, at best, indispensable for only a subset of models in the theory, right? Let me explain why. So crucial to all of this is what's sometimes called the Thomas theorem, which is that quoted passage there within the Bonilla-Silva quote, right? If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Fun historical aside, the reason it's called the Thomas theorem is because there was a power couple of social scientists in the early to mid 20th century, William Isaac Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas, who wrote this sentence down in a book called The Child in America, right? Right, so the Thomas theorem actually looms large, right, in why race theorists are social constructionists, right? And we see something very similar from Omi and Winan, right? But when we actually turn to the unified theoretical structure, here's what we see, right? Everything sort of highlighted in yellow are the consequences of defining or treating race as real, right? But it doesn't entail that we need to be realists about race, right? So it could be that race is a very powerful illusion, right? So the standard analogy that gets drawn here is which was a social category, which had clear social consequences, right? But no one's a realist about witches, right? So nothing in the theory forces you to be a realist about race, right? Note that you might also have what we might call an antisocial conception of race. And that wouldn't, that'd be entirely consistent with the theoretical structure, right? It still would have all sorts of social consequences, right? Including, right, lots of meanings, values, et cetera, attached to these non-social racial categories, right? That could sort of power you through the rest of that mechanism, right? So none of this is built in, right? Having said that, I don't want to come down one way or the other. Here's what I think you need to do. You need to find specific models that achieve a certain level of empirical success and say, what do these tell me about what race has to be in order to achieve this kind of empirical success? And so there's why I think it's that's going to be your best bet for hashing out metaphysical discussions about race, right? But I don't think it should be taken as integral to the theory is the crucial thing I want to hear about. All right, let's turn to an easier topic. Political commitments in race theories. Right. So once again, it's a feature of, I would say, an overwhelming majority of race theorists that they sort of understand their theory to be committed in some way to anti-racist causes. Right. And obviously, in saying that this is no more than an optional choice, I'm not sort of hoping that a bunch of people become racists after this. I simply want to point out that it's not built into the structure of the theory, right? That you have a particular political cause, right? So here's one way we can kind of see this. Suppose that I'm an anti-racist and I'm trying to model something using this unifying framework, right? I might think to myself, how am I going to de-schematize some of these schematic variables, right? And I might do something like think, well, maybe the theory of structural racism, right, is a good way of modeling that situational mechanism. Right, what have I done at this point? What I want to point out is actually not very much, right? Essentially what you've done is you've chosen what you want to study, right? Which causal structures you want to study and which phenomena to study, right? There's no testing that's happened at this point. You're just building a theory or a model, right? And there's nothing about being an anti-racist which commits you, which gives you exclusive domain over looking at exactly those causal structures and phenomena, right? You could be a relatively apolitical person who thinks, I don't know what I think about the role of ideology. right, in shaping preferences. But I'm going to check it out, right? And that would be a perfectly fine move, right? And so what I want to suggest is your political stance is completely optional in terms of the role that anti-racism might play in this theoretical structure. Right? Now, you might think that's too kind of a lesson, right? You might think, well, actually, there should be no political values playing any role in any of this. And I think the most compelling reason for thinking of this would be a commitment to the value-free ideal, right? Which is very roughly the idea that only epistemic values legitimately influence scientific reasoning, right? But I want to suggest that the value-free ideal is in fact consistent with everything that I've said so far, right? Right, so when we think about what the value-free ideal is prohibiting, it's the use of values in, say, your choice of methods, how you come about your findings, the conclusions you draw from those findings, right? But what we're talking about here, right, is much more in the context of discovery, right? What's external to scientific reason, right? There's obviously many more complicated stories to be told, but what I want to point out is, once again, there's nothing in the structure of this unifying theory which commits you one way to the other to a particular political cause. And one thing I'm hoping to explore further is what this might mean for how we teach race in education, right? At least one proposal is we can be a lot more explicit about where we're making value judgments, but divorce those, for example, from evidence we have for causal claims, right? Something I'm just thinking about, but haven't really worked through. Okay, so wrapping up, here are the take-home lessons. Sociologists have sought a more systematic theory of race. I'm trying to deliver the goods on that. I'm at the very early stages of delivering the goods, I hope. This systematicity might be achieved by showing how theories of race answer the same kinds of questions using the same kinds of causal models, right? And as I suggested, systematizing in this way has two kinds of heuristic value, right? The first is that it can guide researchers to seek out new phenomena and new social mechanisms, right? And the second is that it invites researchers to determine how integral certain commitments, in this case I focused on metaphysics and politics, are to their explanations. There should be sound coming. There should be sound coming. I don't know what's happening. Where's the sound? Ah, damn it. Okay, we're not getting sound. This was going to be a great finale, ruined by technology. We even tested it. Oh, it's quiet. All right, hold on. All right. I had this dramatic ending. It was going to be great. It'll still be great. There we go. That's fine. Oh. Thanks.